The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. It was a sound Alina knew well, the metronome of her life as a nurse. She checked the 4-drip, her movements economical and practiced, her eyes scanning the readouts. The man in the bed was a statue carved from Italian marble, all hard lines and unnerving stillness. He was just a patient, another body in a bed in the hospital's exclusive VIP wing. That is what she told herself. But the 2 men in dark suits standing guard outside the door, their stillness a perfect mirror of the man on the bed, told a different story. And the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. A mixture of antiseptic, expensive cologne, and fear. She knew this kind of fear. It was a taste she had forced herself to forget, a language she had sworn never to speak again. Her job was to keep this man alive. It was a simple, clinical task. However, the heavy gold signet ring on his finger, bearing the crest of a 2-headed eagle, was not simple. It was a complication she could not afford. It was a ghost from a life she had burned to the ground, a life that had cost her everything. The man's name on the chart was Marco Valenti, but that was not the name the ring spoke of. The ring spoke of power, of blood, and of a world where men like him were not patients. They were kings. Now, she was locked in this silent room with a fallen king, and the silence was starting to feel like a countdown. She finished her checks, her professionalism a shield against the memories clawing at the edges of her mind. She turned to leave, her hand on the door. One of the guards outside shifted, his shoulder blocking the small glass window. They were not just guarding him from the outside world. They were guarding the outside world from him. And now, by extension, they were guarding her. She was a witness to his weakness, a liability. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, settled in her stomach. She had spent years building a new life, a quiet life, a life where the only beeps were from machines that saved people. But with one look at that ring, she knew the walls of that life were about to come crashing down. She was no longer just a nurse. She was a secret keeper. The senior neurologist, Dr. Evans, stood by the window, his reflection a pale, worried ghost in the tinted glass. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his frustration a palpable force in the room. He had been in and out for 2 days, running every test he could think of. The scans were clear. No significant bleed, no observable swelling beyond what was expected from the impact. The man on the bed, Marco Valenti, should have been waking up. His brain showed activity, patterns of deep sleep, but no response to stimuli. Not a twitch, not a flicker. It was as if his mind had locked the door and thrown away the key. "I do not understand it," Evans muttered, more to himself than to Alina. "It's like he's choosing not to wake up." Alina kept her expression neutral, her hands busy adjusting the crisp white sheet over Marco's chest. Choosing. She knew that was not a medical term, but it felt right. Men like him were forged in control. To be helpless, to be inert on a hospital bed with machines breathing for him, would be a fate worse than death. Perhaps some part of him knew that. Perhaps it was easier to stay lost in the dark than to wake up into this bright, sterile cage, surrounded by enemies he could not see. One of his men, a younger one with restless eyes and a jaw that never unclenched, had cornered her in the hall earlier. His name was Nico. "Is he?" Nico had started, unable to finish the question. The fear in his eyes was not for his boss's health. It was for the vacuum his absence created, a vacuum that others would rush to fill. She saw it then, the subtle shift in the hierarchy. The guards outside were not just his men. They were the family's men. And without him to lead, they were a pack of wolves without an alpha. Their loyalty was to the position, and the man in this bed was no longer in it. "His vitals are stable," she had told Nico, her voice clipped and professional. It was the truth, but it was not an answer. The truth was that the longer he remained like this, the less likely it was he would ever wake up to a world that still belonged to him. The 2-headed eagle on his ring seemed to mock her. It was a symbol of seeing in 2 directions at once, past and future. Her own past was a minefield, and she was standing right in the middle of it. She could feel the pressure building, the weight of what she knew pressing down on her. She had to get out. But every time she looked at the door, at the silent sentinels standing guard, she knew there was no exit. Not anymore. Later that night, the floor was quiet. The shift change had brought a temporary lull, a blessed silence that settled over the wing. Dr. Evans had gone home, defeated for the day. Nico and the other guard were downstairs, a rare moment of privacy she knew would not last. It was just her and the man in the bed and the steady, lonely beep of the monitor. She stood over him, the chart in her hand forgotten. His face, in repose, was less severe. The harsh lines around his mouth softened, the faint scar bisecting his left eyebrow looking less like a warning and more like a flaw in the marble. He looked younger than the force of nature his reputation suggested. He looked human, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. Her brother used to talk about him. He had spoken of the Aquila, the eagle, with a kind of reverence. The man who saw everything, who moved with a surgical precision that left no witnesses and no loose ends. Her brother had been an associate, young and ambitious, caught up in the promise of that world. A world that had chewed him up and spit him out, leaving her to bury what was left. She had run then. She had changed her name, bleached the past from her life, and dedicated herself to healing, as if to atone for the breaking she had witnessed. Now the eagle himself was here, broken, caged. A reckless impulse, born of grief and a sudden, desperate need to know, seized her. She looked at the door, then back at his still face. No one would know. It would be a whisper, a ghost of a word. She leaned closer, the scent of him, sandalwood and something metallic like cold steel, filling her senses. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage. This was madness. This was a line she could never uncross. But she had to know if the legend was real, or if he was just another man of flesh and blood. She lowered her head until her lips were almost touching his ear. The word felt foreign on her tongue, a relic from a buried life. "Aquila," she whispered, the sound barely disturbing the air. Nothing happened. She felt a wave of foolish relief wash over her. It was just a story. He was just a man. She straightened up, turning to leave. Then she saw it. The fingers on his right hand, the one with the ring, had curled. A slow, deliberate clenching of a fist. Her breath caught in her throat. The monitor, which had been beeping in a steady rhythm, suddenly skipped a beat, then another, the line on the screen jumping in a frantic, erratic dance. He was in there, and he had heard her. The door clicked open behind her. Nico stood there, his eyes narrowed, darting from the frantic monitor to her pale face, then to Marco's clenched fist. He had seen it. He had seen everything. The world tilted on its axis, the quiet hum of the hospital fading into a roar in her ears. She had not just whispered a name. She had lit a fuse. Nico stepped into the room, letting the door swing shut behind him with a soft, final thud. The sound echoed like a jail cell door locking. He did not say a word. He just looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw her quiet, carefully constructed life burn to ash. She was no longer a nurse caring for a patient. She was a woman who knew too much, standing over the one man who could decide if she lived or died. And she had just proven she held the key. "How do you know that name?" Nico's voice was low, each word a carefully polished stone of menace. It was not a question. It was a demand, an accusation. Alina's mind raced, searching for a lie, any lie that would sound plausible. But her throat was dry, her thoughts scattered like glass. The professional mask she wore had shattered. She was 22 years old, and she suddenly felt like the 19-year-old girl who had stood over her brother's grave, promising to leave this world behind forever. I read it," she stammered, the lie thin and unconvincing even to her own ears. "In his chart. An alias, maybe?" Nico took a step closer. He was not a large man, but he moved with a predator's economy, taking up all the oxygen in the room. "There is nothing in his chart but the name Marco Valenti. I know. I read it myself." Every page his eyes flickered back to Marco's hand, which had slowly, almost imperceptibly, relaxed. The monitor had settled back into its steady rhythm. But the moment had happened. The evidence was undeniable. "You will tell me," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming something intimate and terrifying, "or your next shift will be in the morgue." As a resident, Alina swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. Showing it would be a death sentence. She had learned that much from her brother. "His family was from the same village as my grandmother's in Sicily," she said, the lie coming more easily this time, woven from threads of truth. "Aquila. It's a common name there. I thought maybe it would be familiar. A sound from home. It was weak, but it was something. It was a story that did not connect her directly to his world." Nico stared at her for a long, silent moment, weighing the lie. She could see the calculations in his eyes. She was a nurse, an outsider. Her story was improbable, but the alternative, that a random nurse in a New York hospital knew his boss's operational call sign, was impossible. He did not believe her. Not entirely. But for now it was enough to keep her breathing. "You will not leave this suite," he said. It was not a request. "Another nurse will bring you what you need. You are his private care now. Your only patient." He turned and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "If he wakes up, you are a hero. If he does not—" He did not need to finish the sentence. The threat hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. The door closed, and she was alone again. A prisoner in a gilded cage, chained to the man in the bed by a single whispered word. Days bled into a week. Alina's world shrank to the four walls of the luxury hospital suite. Another nurse, a nervous woman named Sarah, would bring her meals and fresh scrubs, her eyes never quite meeting Alina's. The guards outside were a constant presence, their faces impassive, their silence absolute. Alina fell into a routine, a rhythm dictated by the machines and the needs of the man who never stirred. She monitored his vitals, administered his medication, and turned him every 2 hours to prevent sores. Her movements were clinical, detached. It was the only way to survive, to keep the rising panic at bay. She was a professional. This was her job. But at night, in the quiet hours when the city outside slept, the lines would blur. She would sit in the chair by his bed and watch him, the only light coming from the glowing screens of the monitors. She learned the landscape of his face, the way his dark lashes rested against his high cheekbones, the faint lines of strain around his eyes, even in this deep state of unconsciousness. He was a man who carried the world on his shoulders, and it had finally crushed him. During a brief, flickering moment of consciousness, he had murmured something. A name. Leo. The name was a wound, spoken with a breath of agony that was more profound than any physical pain. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Leo was the reason he was like this. Not the accident itself, but the failure it represented. The person he had not been able to protect. It was a vulnerability she had no right to see, a crack in the armor of the formidable Aquila. It reminded her so much of her own grief for her brother, a hollow ache that never truly went away. In that moment, he was not Marco Valenti, the feared head of the Valenti family. He was just a man haunted by a ghost. A quiet, unbidden empathy took root in her heart. She found herself wanting him to wake up, not just for her own survival, but for him. She wanted him to have a chance to fight the ghosts that held him captive in the dark. One afternoon, while she was checking his pupils with a penlight, his eyes suddenly focused. They were a deep, startling shade of whiskey brown, and for the first time, they were not vacant. They were looking right at her. His gaze was sharp, intelligent, and filled with a pain that stole her breath. He did not speak. He did not move. He just looked at her, and in that silent, searing gaze, a connection was forged. A dangerous, unspoken understanding passed between the prisoner and the warden, and she was no longer sure which one was which. The attack came without warning. It was a quiet Tuesday, the afternoon sun slanting through the blinds. A man in a doctor's coat she did not recognize walked in, holding a chart. He smiled, a flash of white teeth that did not reach his cold eyes. "Dr. Peterson," he said, his voice smooth. "Just here to check on Mr. Valenti's blood work." Nico was gone. A rare trip for a meeting across town. The two regular guards had just been replaced by unfamiliar faces for the shift change. Perfect window. A surgical strike. Alina's instincts, long dormant, screamed. She had seen this man before, a glimpse of him talking to a known rival of the Valentis in a coffee shop downtown months ago. A chance sighting she had dismissed at the time. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was steady. "Dr. Evans is the only physician on this case. I was not informed of any consultation." She moved to stand between the man and Marco's bed. A small, fragile barrier against the coming storm. The man's smile tightened. It was a last-minute request from the board. He held up a syringe, the clear liquid inside glinting in the light. Just a simple vitamin cocktail, potassium chloride. She recognized the vial he had palmed. Odorless, colorless, and in a high enough dose, untraceable in an autopsy if you knew what you were doing. It would stop a heart in seconds. It would look like a medical complication. There was no time to scream for help. The new guards outside were likely his. She had to act. Thinking fast, she stumbled, knocking a tray of metal instruments to the floor with a deafening crash. "Oh, I am so sorry," she cried, her voice high and panicked, a perfect imitation of a flustered nurse. The man, startled by the noise, flinched. It was the opening she needed. As she bent down to help him pick up the scattered tools, she palmed a heavy stainless steel kidney basin. "Here, let me get that," she said, her eyes wide and innocent. As he reached for a fallen scalpel, she brought the basin up in a swift, brutal arc, striking the syringe and his hand with all her strength. The syringe flew from his grasp, shattering against the far wall. The man swore, his face contorting in a mask of fury. He lunged for her, but the crash had done its job. The door burst open and one of the regular guards, back early, stood there, his gun drawn. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. The fake doctor froze, his hands raised. He had failed. Alina stood, her chest heaving, the heavy basin still clutched in her hand. She had not just saved Marco. She had declared her allegiance. In this world, neutrality was not an option. In the chaotic aftermath, Alina moved with a chilling efficiency. While the guards subdued the fake doctor and dragged him away, she quickly gathered the shattered pieces of the syringe and the vial. Before anyone could think to question it, she disposed of them in the hazardous waste container, burying them deep beneath other medical refuse. She then took Marco's chart and, with a trembling but steady hand, made a note. "Patient agitated. Dislodged for line." Saline drip replaced. It was a lie. A fabrication that erased the assassination attempt and replaced it with a mundane medical event. It was an obstruction of justice. It was a felony. It was the only move she had. If the hospital administration, or worse, the police, started an official investigation, this entire floor would be locked down. The Valenti family would lose control of the situation, and Marco would be a sitting duck. Her lie protected him. It also implicated her, tying her fate to his in a way that could never be undone. She had crossed a line from a civilian caught in the crossfire to an active conspirator. She looked at her hands. They were the hands of a healer, but they had just committed a crime. She felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The girl who had run from this life was gone. A woman who knew how to survive in it stood in her place. Later that evening, Nico returned, his face a grim mask. He had been briefed. He walked over to the bed, looking down at Marco. Then his eyes found Alina, who was standing quietly by the window. "You did well," he said. It was not praise. It was an assessment, a statement of fact. "We are in your debt in his world." Debts were a currency more valuable than money. They were also a cage. She just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She had saved his boss, and in doing so had shackled herself to the family. That night, Marco's eyes opened again. This time they were clear, lucid, and fixed on her. He had been awake. He had heard the crash, had seen the blur of motion. He had been a prisoner in his own body, a silent witness to her actions. His voice, when he spoke, was a rough, gravelly whisper, raw from disuse. He did not thank her. He did not ask what had happened. He only said one word. Her name. Alina. He had never spoken her name before. The way he said it was different from anyone else. It was not a question or a statement. It was a recognition, an acknowledgement of the debt he now owed her. It was the sound of a claim being made, a piece of his world being placed in her hands. She met his gaze, and in the space of that single word, the ground shifted beneath them forever. He was the eagle, and she was the one who had kept him from falling from the sky. The enemy did not wait long to send their next message. 2 days later, Sarah, the timid nurse who brought Alina's meals, arrived with a tremor in her hands and a fresh bruise blooming on her cheek. She avoided Alina's eyes, setting the tray down with a clatter. "What happened to you?" Alina asked, her voice sharp with concern. Sarah just shook her head, a tear tracing a path through her foundation. I fell," she whispered, the lie flimsy and pathetic. But the message was clear. It was not for Sarah. It was for Alina. They knew who was keeping Marco alive. They knew who mattered. And they could get to anyone. When Nico saw the nurse, his face turned to stone. He took Alina into the adjoining sitting room, his movements tight with controlled fury. "This is my fault," he said, his voice a low growl. "I should have had you moved. Secured your apartment." Alina's blood ran cold. Her apartment. The small, safe space she had called her own. The one place in the world that was hers. "They know where I live?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nico's silence was answer enough. The life she had built was not just cracked. It was transparent. They could see right through it. That night, Marco was sitting up in bed, propped against a mountain of pillows. He was still weak, his voice a rasp, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He had seen the bruised nurse. He had seen the look on Nico's face. He watched as Alina went about her duties, her movements just as precise as always, but with a new tension in her shoulders. He was a man who read silence better than most men read books. He knew she was afraid. He beckoned her closer with a slight tilt of his head. "They went to your home," he stated. It was not a question. She stopped beside his bed, her hands clenched at her sides. "They just tossed it," she said, trying to sound detached, as if they had merely been an inconvenience. "Broke a few things. Nothing important." He continued to watch her, his gaze intense, stripping away her defenses. "Nothing is unimportant when it is yours," he said softly. The words were simple, but they carried an immense weight. It was an acknowledgement of her loss, of the violation. It was the closest he could come to an apology for what his world had brought to her door. In that moment he was not her patient, and she was not his nurse. They were two people in a storm, and he had just admitted he was the one who had dragged her into it. His protection had failed her before it had even begun. And for a man like Marco Valenti, failure was a sin that could only be paid for in blood. The decision was made to move him. The hospital was no longer secure. A private facility owned and staffed by men loyal to the Valenti family had been prepared. The transfer was scheduled for 3 in the morning, a time when the hospital was at its quietest, its hallways dark and empty. It was the most vulnerable he would be, moving from one cage to another, exposed to the world in between. Alina insisted on going with him. She was the only one who knew his current medical state, the subtle changes in his condition that only she would notice. Nico had argued, but Marco had silenced him with a single, sharp glance. Alina would go. They moved through the silent hospital like ghosts. Marco was in a wheelchair, a blanket over his lap, flanked by Nico and 2 other guards. Alina walked beside him, a medical bag in her hand. The air was thick with a tension so profound it was almost a physical presence. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant sound a potential attack. As they reached the ambulance waiting at a deserted emergency entrance, it happened. A black sedan screeched around the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkness, pinning them like insects. Two men jumped out, guns raised. Alina did not scream. Her training, her instincts, her past, it all clicked into place. While Nico and the guards returned fire, creating a wall of noise and chaos, she acted. She knew Marco was too weak to run. She shoved his wheelchair hard, not toward the ambulance, but toward a side door marked linen supply. It was a dead end. A small, windowless room, but it was cover. As bullets ricocheted off the brick wall behind them, she bundled him out of the chair and into the cramped space, slamming the heavy metal door shut just as a bullet sparked against the frame. They were plunged into darkness, the smell of bleach and clean cotton surrounding them. The sounds of the gunfight outside were muffled. For a moment they were safe. He leaned heavily against her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the warmth of his body, the thud of his heart against her own. She had not waited to be rescued. She had created the rescue. She had saved him again. The gunshots outside tapered off, replaced by the sound of squealing tires and then an unnerving silence. Alina held her breath, her body a rigid shield in front of his. She could feel the fine tremor of exhaustion running through him. He was alive, but the effort had cost him dearly. A key scraped in the lock. Alina tensed, grabbing the only thing she could find in the dark, a heavy metal mop handle. The door swung open, revealing Nico, his face grim, a fresh cut bleeding on his temple. "It is done," he said, his eyes finding them in the gloom. "They are gone." The rest of the transfer was a blur. They made it to the new facility, a discreet brownstone that looked like any other on the quiet residential street. Inside, it was a state-of-the-art medical clinic. Marco was settled into a room that looked more like a luxury hotel suite than a hospital bed. The danger, for now, had passed. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. Alina stood by the window, watching the city wake up, feeling a bone-deep weariness she had never known. She had survived the night, but she knew this was not the end. It was the beginning. Marco had been silent since the attack, his energy spent. Now he spoke her name, his voice stronger than it had been. "Alina," she turned from the window. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Nico will arrange it," he said. "A new name, a new life, anywhere in the world you want to go. Enough money that you will never have to work again." It was the out she had been dreaming of. Clean break. A chance to get her life back, to disappear before his world swallowed her completely. It was everything she should have wanted. She thought of her small apartment, now a crime scene. She thought of her quiet life, now a memory. She could have it all back or something even better. Freedom. Safety. She looked at him, really looked at him. The man who was a legend, the eagle. The man who was haunted by a ghost named Leo. The man who had looked at her and seen her when she was invisible to everyone else. She had run from this life once. Running again felt like a different kind of death. It felt like a betrayal, not of him, but of the woman she had become in these last few weeks. The woman who did not flinch in the face of gunfire. The woman who could save a king. She walked over to the medical cart, her movements calm and deliberate. She picked up his chart, uncapped a pen, and made a note about his blood pressure. She then walked to his bed and held the chart out to him. "Your pressure is a little high," she said, her voice even. Which is understandable, all things considered. It was a simple, professional act. But it was an answer. It was a choice. She was not leaving. He took the chart from her, his fingers brushing against hers. He did not look at the numbers. His eyes stayed on her face. A slow, almost imperceptible change occurred in his expression. It was not a smile. It was something rarer. It was the dawn of hope in the eyes of a man who had thought he had none left. The city was waking up outside, but in this quiet room, a new world was just beginning, and she was choosing to stay right in the center of it.